Framer is known for its ability to create beautiful websites that come alive with stunning animation. And in Framer, the most common way to add animation to your site is using effects. And in this crash course tutorial, I'm going to teach you everything that you need to know about effects so you can bring your site to life. Let's go. So let's actually start by looking at what an effect is and how they actually work. So traditionally, when we think about animation, essentially what we're doing is animating between different keyframes. So for example, if you want to animate a ball going up in the air and then coming back down, you would essentially animate between those keyframes. So you might have one where it starts at the bottom left here as shown on the screen, then it might go to the top left, then it might go to the top right, then it kind of might bounce off this invisible wall that we've got here and go to the bottom middle. And essentially we set a keyframe at each one of those points. So essentially in Framer with effects, we can only animate to one keyframe. Now, if you do want to create more complex animation with multiple keyframes, you can do this in Framer as well, just not using the effects method. And it's something I'll be teaching here on the channel in the future, and it's also in my Framer course. But we won't go too much into detail about creating keyframe animations today, because we're going to focus on the basics of effects. Okay, so inside of Framer, we can apply effect to basically any element that we want. Now, there are some things that you cannot apply an effect to. For example, maybe an SVG, a form field. There's just a few random things you just can't apply effects to, but everything like frames, components, text, you can. So when I select an element on my canvas here, on the right-hand properties panel, we have this tab called effects. Then when I click on this, you'll see we've got a bunch of different options. Now, there's three main types of effects. There's text effects, there's basic effects, and then there's scroll effects. So let's start with some basic effects so we can actually understand the anatomy of how effects work. So I'll press on this little plus here and let's select the appear effect to start with. Now, you'll notice we've got a few different things going on here. First, we have the trigger, which is essentially the trigger point of when this effect starts to play. So we can set the trigger to be on appear, on scroll, layer in view, or section in view. If it's on appear, that means that when it appears, so when the page loads, then it's going to play that animation. If it's on scroll, it's going to animate while it scrolls. Layer in view is, well, when it comes into view within the viewport. And we also have section in view, which is super handy, especially as we create more complex effects. Now, we also have presets, which is a sort of default option for getting started. So I could select any one of these presets. So for example, if I want to go slide in bottom, then it's automatically going to apply that effect. And if I actually preview my site here, you will notice when I reload that, it's now going to slide in bottom. And I literally didn't have to do any work. But where the magic happens is when we actually set the enter and exit effect. But where the magic happens is where we set the enter effect. Now, like I mentioned, we can only really animate between two key points when it comes to effects. So we have an enter stage and we have an exit stage. Now, the exit stage by default in Framer is by where it sits on the canvas initially. And then we essentially add a enter effect, which is where it starts, and then it's basically going to end up where you want it to on the design. So when we go into this property here, you can see we can set that enter effect. So in this case, since we set the preset to be slide in bottom, you notice it's going to start at 0% opacity. The scale is going to remain at 1. There's going to be no rotation or no skew, but we are going to offset it by 150Y. Now, I could change this and make it say 50, so it's actually going to start 50 pixels below its initial state. And then this way, when I actually preview this, it's not as jumpy. Now, the other great thing about effects is we can actually control the momentum and the speed and the feel of that animation itself with transitions. Now, when we talk about transitions, we've got two types. We've got ease and we've got spring. Let's start with ease. So ease is basically controlling the momentum of that animation. Think of it like designing a roller coaster, where if you start really high and then you go down, you're going to gain a lot of speed. And then if you try to go back up, you're going to naturally just like decrease that speed. So for example, I kind of have these points here that I can start to drag around, and you can start to see the shape of this effect come to play. So for example, if I make it really sharp like this, it means it's going to go really quick at the start, and then it's going to slow down over time. Or I could do the opposite of that and I could make it go really slow at the start and then speed up at the end. So we can kind of play around with these sort of bevels here and trying to get this sort of effect that we want. Again, if we have something like this, it's going to go slow at the start, then it's going to go really quick, and then it's going to slow back down at the end. Which if I preview this, it might be a bit hard to see because it's very quick, but it goes really quick at the start, and then it kind of slows down just a little bit at the end. Now, I can also set the time, so the duration of that animation, and I can also set a delay. So if I set a delay, essentially what happens is when the trigger point occurs, so on appear, on scroll, or layer in view, or section in view, then it will be delayed. That animation will wait however long you set here. So for example, if I want to delay it by 1 second, you'll notice when I preview my site, it waits 1 second, and then it plays that animation. So let's also extend the duration here. So we're going to set the time to be 1 second, and let's preview that again. And now you'll see starts slow, speeds up, and finishes slow. So that's ease. Now let's talk about spring transitions. Now, if you drop a ball from a height, it's going to hit the ground and then it's going to bounce back up. Then it's going to hit the ground again and it's going to bounce back up, but not as high. And it's going to hit the ground and it's going to bounce back up, but not as high again. And it's going to keep doing that until it stops. And again, this is a real sort of like gravity sort of effect. Spring animation in Framer makes sure effects feel soft and alive using physics. Now, if you compare this to ease, which is very like controlled and almost robotic, like how you design it is the way it goes, spring is a much more natural sort of approach. And we can do this based on time or physics. So time is basically speed controlled by time times bounce density. So for example, if I want to make this quite slow, so let's say the time of this animation is going to be 5 seconds, but we give it a lot of bounce, then you'll notice over that 5 seconds, it's going to play a lot of times and it's going to have a lot of bounce. But for example, if we want to reduce the bounce and just set a long duration, you'll notice that it comes in quite smoothly. Now we also have this little preview down here. So if you don't want to preview your website every time, you can kind of just use this sort of UI here to get a quick example of how that animation's actually going to play out. Now let's actually talk about physics here. So we have stiffness, we have damping, and we have mass. So stiffness is, do we want a flat or curved speed animation? So for example, if I reduce the stiffness here, you'll notice it's going to get quite smooth and it's going to start to flatten out. But if I increase that stiffness, it's going to actually give a bit of a bump, and becomes a point where that bump becomes too much and it's almost like just going over a hill. So again, if I preview this, you notice we kind of get that little bounce happening. So my sort of default for animation, just out of the box, is normally just having a stiffness of 150, and then that's all I really do. Now, dampening is, do we want a lot of momentum in our bounce? So you'll notice if I kind of reduce that dampening, you'll notice we kind of start to get that wave effect happening again. And if I increase the stiffness, I could have more of it, or if I reduce it, we're going to have less. So we can actually create a lot of really cool effects using this physics-based approach for Framer. And then mass is basically, do we want lots or less bounces? So if I want lots and to kind of extend the duration of those bounces, I can do that here, or I can kind of reduce it down. I think the great thing about animation in Framer is just to play around and see what you can come up with. Like, I'm not an animator by any means, but I kind of learned a lot of this stuff just by playing around, seeing what works. When you slide things up or slide things down, it changes these things in that way. And I think just naturally, that's the best way you can learn anything when it comes to animation in Framer. So let's actually start applying some effects to an actual landing page here so we can give this some context. So we started to cover some basic effects, and basic effects are appear, which we covered, hover, so when you actually hover, you can actually play a certain effect, pressed, loop, and drag. Now for a press effect, basically when I press and hold on an animation, it's going to play a certain effect. For a loop, we could actually make something, say, rotate all the time. So for example, if I want to take this text here and just have it on constant rotation, we can actually set up a loop effect, and we can set that time to either mirror or just loop. So mirror means when it goes one way and then goes back the other, and it just kind of continues to repeat forever. So you will notice when I play this, obviously it doesn't look very good, but it's kind of looping around over and over, and that's essentially what a loop effect is. Now we also have a drag effect. So let's say, for example, I have these clouds here and I want to be able to drag them. We can actually set the settings for effects here. So freeform means I can kind of drag it anywhere, and snapback means when I drag it, will it go back to its initial place? And again, I can control the spring inside here as well. So now if I preview this, you notice I can actually drag this cloud wherever I want, but when I let it go, it's going to go back to its initial place. So we're never really going to truly kill the design. So for example, if I was going to animate this hero section, I would probably use a lot of basic effects. So for this initial text here, what I might actually do is make it so on appear, it's going to slide in from the bottom. And we're actually going to set the y-axis, so the enter effect, to be 50 pixels below. And we'll set a transition and we'll set the stiffness to be 150. This, again, is my sort of like default when it comes to animation, but it really does depend on what you're trying to do. So when I preview this, you notice we kind of get this nice sort of fade in effect. Now, one of the really great things about Framer is I can copy and paste this effects to other elements on my page. So if I just right click this layer and go copy, copy effects, then if I say selected the text underneath, I can actually just paste that effect. So now you notice when I preview this, they both actually fade in at the same time. But we can go one step further here and say add a delay to the paragraph text here, and we're actually going to get a bit of a staggered effect. So if we delay it by say 0.3 seconds and preview this, you'll now notice that we start to get a really nice animation sort of play. So we could do the same with this element here. So I'm just going to paste in that effect, and I'm going to also add an additional delay of say 0.6. So we're increasing it by another 0.3 seconds. And now you notice we get this really nice subtle play effect. So that's basic effects. Now we also have text effects, which we can add to specifically just text layers. So for example here, we might want this text to yes fade in, but we can also stack effects as well. So we could add a text effects here, and essentially we can set our trigger, so on appear, and then we could set a preset. So we might actually want it to shoot in, and then we can set the per. So is it per character, per word, per line, or per element? So if we made it per word, essentially it's going to stagger in like this preview showing per word. So when I actually preview this, you notice we kind of get this cool sort of bounce. Now, since we also have this sort of like appear effect happening here, maybe that's not the greatest thing. So what we'll actually do is get rid of that appear effect, because the text effect is basically doing that for us. So when I preview this, you will now notice that text comes in and then everything else fades in as well. Okay, so we've covered text effects, we've covered basic effects, and now let's look at scroll effects. Now we have 4 types of scroll effects. We have scroll animation, scroll speed, scroll transform, and scroll variant. Let's start with scroll animation. So I have a section set up here with a scroll section with the ID section-1. And what I want to do is make it so when I scroll this section, this plane here is going to animate from left to right. So I'll select my little plane image here. We'll go to effects and we'll go scroll animation. And I'm going to set the trigger point to be section in view. So this effect only applies when this section-1 is in view. So I can select that section here. And then we can set the viewport trigger, so when that animation actually plays. So we might want to set it to stay the center. We can set it to either replay or not. So do we want it to repeat if someone scrolls down, then scrolls back up? And then we can set our effect. So in this case, we're going to have an enter and an exit effect. So the enter effect is actually going to be 100% opacity, but we're actually going to start it way on the left-hand side. So let's say we're going to move it, say negative 500 pixels on the left. And then the exit effect is basically the opposite way. So it's going to go 500 pixels to the right here. And let's also set a bit of a transition. Let's change the stiffness to be 150. So now when I actually scroll this section, you will notice that when I reach the halfway point, that plane is actually going to move to the center. And then when I scroll away, you might not be able to see it. It's actually going to move to the right-hand side, which if I quickly scroll back up, you'll see that it jumps back from the left. And we can also repeat that animation. So that's a scroll animation. Now let's leave that one for now and let's actually look at scroll transform. Now, similar to scroll animation, we're animating between 2 points, but that scroll will actually continue to transform over that whole duration of that trigger. So for example, if it's just on scroll, that's going to happen over the entire page. But if we set it to, say, section and view, and then if we select our section again, and we'll set our viewport to be to the center, then let's do the same effects. So let's actually set the offset to be -500, and the opacity and scale to be 1, and then the exit is going to be 500. Now you'll notice that when I preview this and scroll this section, as I scroll, it's going to move from left to right, and it's not as jumpy as before because we're not actually just animating the trigger point. And it's actually playing that whole animation over the duration of that trigger, which in this case is this section here. Okay, so next let's talk about scroll speed, which is essentially how we start to create a parallax effect in Framer. So for example, I've kind of got this background image here, and let's say I want everything else to kind of move faster as I scroll, but this kind of image in the background goes a bit slower. So what I could do is actually select that graphic that I have here, go to effects and apply a scroll speed. Now, if I set it to 110%, it's going to scroll at the speed of 110% of the normal page, which means it's going to go a little bit faster than everything else. But if I slow it down, say 90%, then you'll notice that when I actually preview this and I start to scroll my site, you'll notice that everything else is kind of moving normally, but this image here behind is actually only moving at 90% speed. So we start to get this basically a parallax effect. And this can be really powerful, especially if you multiply this across multiple elements on the page. So that was scroll speed. Now, the last thing I want to show you is scroll variants, where on scroll, we can actually transition between component variants. So for example, I have this basic component set up for a button, and we have this initial variant, which is shown on our canvas here. And then we basically have the variant that we want to switch it to on scroll. So we might want to make it that when someone reaches this section of the website, then it changes that component variant. So we can only apply this to components, but when I have a component selected on the canvas, I can go to effects and I can go scroll variant. And again, let's set our trigger here to be section in view. Now, it's probably worth noting, you'll notice I'm using section in view a lot as a trigger. I prefer this over layer in view just because you can have a little bit more control over when that animation plays. For example, you can set anything to be a scroll section in Framer. So even if I wanted the trigger point to be this text up here for whatever reason, I could actually do that and it could affect somewhere else on the page. So again, it just gives a little bit more control. But back to our component here, let's open up that scroll variant animation and let's set the viewport trigger to be to the middle, and we'll make it that it's going to replay. And then we can select the section that we want it to be triggered by, so section number 1, and then we'll set the variant that we want it to switch to. So we might want it to switch to variant number 2. Now, if we wanted to as well, we could add multiple triggers. So maybe there's another section that we set up and then that component again would change to another variant. We can actually get quite complex here. But in this simple sort of format, essentially what we're saying is when it reaches the halfway point of this section, that this component here is going to switch its variant to variant number 2. So let's actually preview this and see that it works. So I'll scroll down and maybe what we'll do is just refresh. Now, it is technically working, as you can maybe kind of see there, but it's happening a little bit too quick. So in this case, it's probably the viewport that's stuffing it up. So let's actually make it that when my viewport reaches the top, then it's actually going to play. So when I scroll, there we go. You will notice that when my viewport reaches the top of that section, then it changes that variant. And again, like how cool of an animation is that? And it really didn't take any sort of complexity to create. So we've covered a lot in this video. We've covered the anatomy of effects. We've looked at text effects, basic effects, and lastly, scroll effects. Now, I want to give you 3 key bits of advice when actually applying effects, because to be honest, I see a lot of mistakes with this stuff every single day. So tip number 1 is to do not overdo it. Less is definitely more. I've seen a lot of Framer sites where people will apply effects to literally everything, and it's just like Internet 2000, and there's just so much going on. Now, tip number 2, which is to do with performance, is that the more there is, the slower the page is naturally going to become. The more animation you have, it's just a bit heavier on the website. Now, Framer do a pretty good job at actually working around this, but to be honest, if everything is animated, your site's going to be slow. So don't do that, and just be aware of the animation that you have. And then tip number 3 is to be subtle. The worst thing is jarring animations where things come in from everywhere and are super quick or super fast. Smooth it out, make it slow, make it feel natural. Again, it completely depends on what you're going for, but from my experience, my go-to sort of effect that I normally apply in terms of a transition is spring, physics, and then the stiffness 150. If you just want a quick and easy way to apply an effect, just do that every single time. Now, I've also actually put together this bit of a cheat sheet with all these sort of like pre-built effects that I've created, and you can just like copy and paste these sort of effects to frames on your canvas. So I'll leave a link to that down below. It's completely free if you want it. I just think it's a good resource to have, especially as you're starting to learn and apply effects to your Framer project. So if you are interested in that resource, I'll include a link down below. Now, if you enjoyed this Framer tutorial and you want more content like this on the channel, feel free to subscribe because we're putting out new Framer videos every single week. And if you are interested in mastering Framer, like truly mastering it, feel free to check out my A to Z course on Framer, where I teach you everything you need to know to really become a Framer master. There's over 100 lessons, 10 hours of content, and we even built the entire course platform on Framer. It's literally like a mini Duolingo for Framer, which is pretty cool. So if you are interested in that, I'll leave all the relevant information down below. But until next time, I'll catch you later.